The village lay nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, a place where tradition dictated every action and every glance. Stone paths wound through clusters of mud brick homes, and the smoke of cooking fires curled lazily into the sky, carrying scents of roasted grains and herbs. At the heart of this village, rituals and customs were not mere practices. They were the threads that held the entire community together. Respect and obedience were demanded at all times, and deviation often came at a steep price. Within this framework, fear was both teacher and enforcer, guiding villagers' behaviors in subtle, yet unyielding ways. Zuri, a young woman known for her quiet intelligence and unyielding spirit, had lived her entire life under these strictures. Her family had always warned her to blend in, to honor the codes of conduct without question, but Zuri's innate sense of fairness and justice often drew her into conflict. She would speak up when she witnessed wrongdoing, question decisions that seemed unjust, and defend those who could not defend themselves. It was this courage, admired by some and envied by others, that would ultimately lead to the tragic events that now unfolded. Accusations had been made against her, murky and unfounded, yet in a society where rumor carried as much weight as evidence, they were enough. The elders convened a council in the village square, their faces stern and unyielding, deliberating over her fate. Voices whispered, some expressing doubt about the accusations, while others insisted that the law of the village must be upheld. Fear gripped the crowd. No one wished to appear sympathetic to someone accused of breaking sacred rules, yet many hesitated at condemning Zuri outright. The decision, however, was swift and unforgiving. To erase her presence and prevent future defiance, the council decreed that Zuri must be buried. Not just buried, but stripped of her name, a symbolic obliteration meant to annihilate her existence in the collective memory of the village. Names carried power. To remove hers was to make her invisible, to deny her both identity and legacy. It was a punishment designed not only to humiliate but to terrify, a warning to all who might challenge the rigid authority of the elders. The villagers participated in her removal with varying degrees of reluctance and fear. Some carried tools and clods of earth with mechanical precision, while others averted their eyes, murmuring prayers that their own complicity might be forgiven. Zuri's body was placed in the shallow grave at the edge of the village, far from the homes and paths where children played, as though distance could suppress the memory of her spirit. There was no ceremony to mark her passing, no final words of comfort or lamentation. Her accusers took care to ensure that she would be forgotten, her existence reduced to a nameless shadow beneath the soil. Even as the earth covered her, a tension lingered in the air. A hush fell over the village, heavy and uneasy, as if the soil itself carried a weight beyond its natural substance. Some villagers sensed a strange vibration beneath their feet, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Others brushed it off as imagination or coincidence, yet a creeping unease spread. The silence was punctuated only by the dull sound of shovels striking earth and the whispered prayers of those unwilling participants who feared both the living and the unknown forces of the land. Despite the attempt to erase her, Zuri's presence was not so easily extinguished. The accusers, convinced that the burial without a name would secure their control and suppress her spirit, did not realize that the earth they disturbed was alive with memory, with energy that could not be silenced. The villagers' fear, their compliance, their whispers of disapproval and doubt, all contributed to a charged atmosphere. Each footstep near the burial site seemed to stir the soil, each breath of wind carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum, as though the village itself were holding its collective breath. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the square and fields, the villagers retreated to their homes. Fires flickered behind window shutters, and the hum of crickets filled the cooling air. Yet, beneath the peaceful exterior of evening routines, an undercurrent of tension remained. Zuri, nameless though she was, had become a presence felt but unseen, a silent witness to the actions of those who sought to erase her. The village, bound tightly by tradition, was on the precipice of a reckoning it could not yet comprehend, for the consequences of attempting to bury a spirit as vibrant and just as hers would not remain hidden for long. The night deepened, enveloping the village in darkness, yet the earth beneath the burial site seemed to pulse with quiet power. The attempt to erase Zuri's identity had failed in ways her accusers could not foresee. Fear and guilt intertwined among those who had participated, leaving a lingering tension that would not easily be resolved. And though she lay beneath the soil without a name, Zuri's story had already begun to stir, whispered by the trembling ground, foreshadowing a force that would soon demand recognition and justice. Beneath the thick layers of soil, Zuri's body lay still, yet her spirit stirred with a force that defied the confines of the grave. Though the village had stripped her of name and identity, her consciousness remained vivid, aware of every stone and clod that pressed upon her chest, every insect that scuttled across the surface above. The earth, once a passive receptacle of her supposed punishment, became a canvas upon which her thoughts, feelings, and growing determination were painted with extraordinary clarity. At first she was consumed by shock and disbelief. How could people who had shared meals, stories, and laughter with her betray her so completely? How could they allow fear and jealousy to dictate such cruelty, burying a living soul as though she were nothing more than refuse? The injustice weighed on her like the soil above, pressing down, but instead of extinguishing her spirit, it awakened a simmering fire. With each passing hour, grief turned into anger and anger into resolve. She refused to be erased, refused to be forgotten. Zuri's awareness extended beyond her immediate surroundings. She could sense the vibrations of footsteps above the ground, the subtle shifts in the village as people moved about their lives, oblivious or dismissive of the life beneath them. She felt the whispered conversations, the hurried murmurs of those who feared her power even in death, and the quiet prayers of those who wished to see justice done. Each sound, each movement became fuel for her growing consciousness, reinforcing her belief that she still mattered, that her story was not yet concluded. The initial hours were spent in silent observation, as Zuri acclimated to the strange world of being buried alive. The soil pressed against her skin, cool and heavy, yet not suffocating. She felt the rhythm of the earth, the slow, almost imperceptible pulses that mirrored the beating of her heart. It was as if the ground itself had taken notice of her injustice, whispering in rhythms only her spirit could interpret. She began to sense a strange symbiosis. The soil, though meant to confine her, offered a conduit through which her energy could flow, reach outward, and resonate with the living world above. Her emotions were a torrent, unrestrained and raw. Grief flowed like a river, mourning the betrayal of her friends and the cold indifference of the elders. Yet, alongside the sorrow, there was a clarity of purpose she had never known in life. The injustice of being nameless, of having her very existence denied, crystallized her understanding of what must be done. She would not allow her spirit to be silenced. She would fight, not with weapons, but with the sheer force of her presence, her awareness, and the connection she felt to the land. As night fell, the world above her seemed to settle into stillness, but beneath the soil, Zuri's spirit became a whirlwind of thoughts, visions, and intention. She imagined the faces of her accusers, their expressions twisted by fear, guilt, and arrogance, and felt a surge of righteous indignation. She realized that the soil, which they had meant to trap her, could become a medium of justice. Every movement of the earth above, every clod of dirt, every tremor, was now part of her consciousness, part of her emerging power. Her anger was tempered by reflection. She did not wish merely to punish, she wished to restore balance, to awaken the village to its own complicity and the moral consequences of their actions. She contemplated the fragility of human authority, how easily fear and rigid customs could be manipulated to oppress the innocent. With each passing hour she crafted a plan, not in words or thought as humans understand them, but as a resonance of intent that would soon reach through the soil and the very roots of the village itself. Zuri also began to feel a profound connection to the wider forces of nature. The roots of trees, the flow of water beneath the earth, even the smallest insects became threads in the network she could sense. The land, she realized, responded to moral energy, to justice and injustice alike. Her grief and anger were no longer solely personal, they were imprinted onto the soil, echoing outward with a force that demanded recognition. She understood, in a deep and intuitive way, that her spirit could move the earth itself if the time came, if her will was resolute enough. The hours stretched into a long, contemplative night. She felt the weight of isolation, but also the emergence of something larger than herself. Her consciousness expanded, encompassing not just her body beneath the soil, but the village above, the fields, the animals, and the very land that had once confined her. She became aware of an energy flowing through her, an unbroken flame of life and purpose. This flame was her name, her identity, her story, all the things her accusers had tried to erase. It burned brightly within, untouchable and eternal. By the first light of dawn, Zuri's spirit had fully awakened. She was no longer a passive victim. She was a force of awareness, of moral authority, and of nature itself. Her anger had crystallized into determination, her grief had transformed into clarity, and her desire for justice had become a guiding power that could no longer be ignored. Even though she lay nameless beneath the soil, her consciousness resonated with such strength that the village above, and the very earth around her, could not remain indifferent for long. Zuri's spirit had become unstoppable. She was alive in ways her accusers could never comprehend, a presence both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a soul that refused erasure, ready to claim her rightful place in the memory and conscience of the world above. As the first light of dawn filtered through the village, the earth above Zuri's nameless grave began to stir in subtle but unmistakable ways. At first, the movements were so slight that only the most observant villagers could notice. A tremor beneath the roots of the trees, a faint vibration in the soil, the soft rustling of leaves without wind. It was as if the ground itself had taken a deep breath, sensing the presence of a spirit that refused to be forgotten. Unseen and unbowed, Zuri's consciousness extended outward, reaching through the layers of earth to send messages in a language older than words, a language that resonated in vibrations, tremors, and subtle signs that life itself could perceive. The roots of the trees, long intertwined with the soil, began to quiver gently. Tiny shoots twisted and curved in patterns that seemed purposeful, their movement almost like a delicate dance choreographed by Zuri's awareness. Birds, perched above on branches, paused mid-song, tilting their heads as if listening to a silent call they alone could perceive. Small animals that scurried through the underbrush, the rabbits, foxes, and squirrels, froze in place, their whiskers twitching, their instincts telling them that something extraordinary was unfolding beneath their feet. Even insects shifted uneasily, ants altering their usual paths, leaving trails in seemingly chaotic patterns, yet each movement carried intent, a faint echo of Zuri's restless spirit. At first, the villagers dismissed these phenomena as coincidence. Perhaps the earth is soft after last night's rain, they whispered to one another. Maybe the wind is stirring the trees differently. But as hours turned to days, the signs became too persistent to ignore. The tremors were rhythmic, subtle pulses that traveled through the soil like a heartbeat. The roots continued their inexplicable swaying, and animals acted in synchronized, almost reverent ways. Even the air seemed to carry whispers, carried on the currents like distant echoes, unintelligible yet charged with meaning. Those who had feared Zuri's power while she lived began to grow uneasy. A group of elders gathered in secret, observing the phenomena with a mix of dread and fascination. They recounted the events of her burial, each remembering the fear and humiliation that had accompanied it. She should be gone, one muttered, shaking his head. But the earth tells a different story. Their hearts pounded with a new anxiety. Perhaps their attempt to erase her name had failed, and worse, perhaps it had awakened something far beyond their control. Zuri, lying beneath the soil, could feel every tremor, every ripple in the earth. Her anger and grief, once confined to her spirit alone, now radiated outward through the ground, finding resonance in the network of roots, stones, and soil particles. She was no longer merely a buried girl. She had become a presence, an awareness intertwined with the very land. Her will, strong and unwavering, carried messages to the world above, messages of injustice, of her innocence, and of the moral debt owed to her. As the vibrations increased, the villagers noticed more pronounced signs. Stones at the edge of her burial site shifted inexplicably, forming shapes that seemed deliberate, lines, circles, symbols that none could fully interpret. Birds swooped in unusual patterns over the site, and the wind carried faint murmurs that sounded almost like human voices. Those who were particularly attuned to the rhythms of the village began to feel an invisible tension beneath their feet, a subtle hum that resonated with a sense of urgency. Some children claimed they could hear a soft singing beneath the ground, and though adults dismissed these claims initially, even they could not ignore the growing sense of awe and unease. Despite the growing signs, the villagers did not yet understand the source of the disturbances. Fear mingled with curiosity, and many avoided the burial site entirely. Superstition spread quickly. Some whispered that Zuri had been cursed, others that the spirits of the earth had become restless. Yet even amidst the uncertainty, a quiet fascination grew. People felt the raw power of the land responding to human injustice, a phenomenon that defied explanation and stirred deep questions about morality, fate, and the consequences of one's actions. The animals, more sensitive to the shifts in energy, acted as heralds of Zuri's presence. Crows circled above the site in unusual formations, foxes prowled along the borders of the grave, and the soft padding of small creatures echoed with purposeful rhythm. Even the fish in the nearby stream swirled against the current in subtle, coordinated patterns, as if the entire ecosystem had become aware of the buried spirit's presence. The villagers began to notice patterns in these occurrences, piecing together a sense of life and consciousness that defied normal understanding. By the third day, the vibrations and whispers had become undeniable. The earth seemed to pulse like a living entity, breathing in tandem with Zuri's spirit. Her anger and grief had transformed into a force that demanded attention, a presence that was at once terrifying and awe-inspiring. Even the most skeptical villagers felt compelled to confront the reality before them, that Zuri, nameless and buried, was not gone. The earth itself carried her voice, her message, her claim to recognition and justice. Though they did not yet fully comprehend her power, the villagers could feel that something extraordinary was unfolding. The soil, roots, and animals all bore witness to a force beyond ordinary human experience. Zuri's consciousness, fueled by her anger, grief, and unwavering desire for justice, was awakening a deep, elemental response. The village teetered on the brink of revelation, poised to confront a truth that could no longer be ignored. A life, even when buried and stripped of name, could leave an indelible mark upon the world, compelling acknowledgement through the whispers and vibrations of the very earth itself. The morning air carried a tension that had not existed the day before. Villagers moving through the central square noticed a subtle vibration beneath their feet, a faint hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the land itself. At first, it was easily dismissed as the rumble of distant wildlife or the shifting of the hills, but as the minutes passed, the trembling became unmistakable. Stones in the pathways quivered, small pebbles rolled slightly downhill, and dust rose from cracks in the earth and ground. Those who had walked the village daily for years sensed an anomaly, a disturbance that spoke of forces far beyond human comprehension. At the edge of the village, near the field where Zuri had been buried namelessly, the tremors grew more pronounced. A single fissure appeared, thin at first, yet extending rapidly in jagged lines across the soil. Grass and weeds were upended, their roots lifted slightly by the subtle movement of the earth. Birds that nested nearby took flight in alarm, their wings beating against the sky as if sensing the urgency of the unseen power beneath. The villagers paused mid-step, their eyes widening in apprehension. Something extraordinary was happening, something alive and aware beneath the soil, something that demanded attention. Rumors began to spread quickly. "The earth trembles because of her," whispered some of the older villagers, recalling the burial and the injustice done. Others shook their heads, too fearful to speak the possibility aloud, yet unable to ignore the evidence before them. Mothers clutched their children, and elders peered warily at the fissures, half expecting the ground to swallow them as it had swallowed their sense of security. The tremors were subtle but constant, a persistent reminder that the buried girl's spirit had not been silenced by soil or secrecy. Zuri, buried beneath the trembling earth, felt every quiver and vibration. Each pulse resonated through her consciousness like a drumbeat, echoing with her growing determination. Her grief had already transformed into righteous indignation, and now her anger translated into tangible motion within the soil. The earth, responsive to her will and her unbroken spirit, began to ripple and shift in ways that no mortal could command. The fissures were her voice, her call for acknowledgement, her assertion that she was neither forgotten nor powerless. The villagers' fear heightened as the tremors became more pronounced. Stones the size of fists rolled slightly across pathways, and cracks appeared near homes that had been built for generations without disturbance. Livestock stirred uneasily in their pens, their instincts telling them that something monumental was unfolding. Even those who had doubted Zuri's power felt an instinctive respect, a trembling acknowledgement of the force they had tried to suppress. The subtle shaking of the earth became impossible to dismiss as natural coincidence. Some of the braver villagers approached the fissures, peering down into the shallow cracks that were forming. They noticed that the soil seemed to pulse as if it were breathing, and faint sounds like whispers carried through the roots could be heard if one listened closely. A chill ran down their spines, an awareness that the world around them had changed. They could not see Zuri, yet her presence was undeniable, and the reality of her power instilled both fear and awe. The tremors spread in unpredictable patterns, moving in waves that reflected Zuri's inner consciousness. Her grief, her anger, and her desire for justice were no longer contained beneath the surface. They had become a living, breathing force. The fissures grew longer and deeper, splitting stones and uprooting small plants. Each movement was purposeful, a testament to her spirit's refusal to be erased. The villagers began to sense a moral weight to the phenomenon, as if the land itself were asserting that the injustice done to Zuri was intolerable. At the village council, panic set in. Elders gathered urgently, debating what could possibly be causing the tremors. Some argued that it was a natural event, a minor earthquake or the shifting of underground streams. Others, more attuned to the stories of spirits and ancestral forces, whispered that Zuri herself had become one with the land, and that her spirit was demanding recognition. The discussion was frantic, but no solution seemed possible. Each attempt to dismiss the tremors only made them more pronounced, more insistent, as if the earth were speaking directly to them. As the day progressed, the fissures began to form in new areas, creeping outward from the burial site. Small stones cracked and split, revealing layers of soil that had not been disturbed for decades. Trees trembled in their roots, leaves quivering even when the wind was still. Birds cawed urgently from the canopy, alerting anyone who would listen. Livestock bolted, sensing danger in the subtle shifts beneath their hooves. The village square, once a place of order and routine, had become a theater of fear and wonder, the ground itself transformed into a medium for Zuri's voice. By late afternoon, villagers could no longer ignore what was happening. Children clung to their mothers, and men and women alike stood at the edge of the fissures, staring in awe at the trembling earth. Whispers of "It is her, she is speaking" spread through the crowd, mingling with gasps and prayers. For the first time, the villagers realized that Zuri's spirit had not been subdued by their attempts to erase her. She was alive in a form they could neither control nor fully understand, demanding acknowledgement through the very soil they walked upon every day. Zuri's anger, grief, and determination had become a force that could not be contained. Each tremor was a word, each fissure a sentence, and each movement of the earth a declaration. She existed, she was wronged, and she would not be forgotten. The villagers, once complacent and fearful, now understood that the injustice they had inflicted was being returned in a form beyond their power, a force that demanded not submission but recognition and justice. By nightfall the village was transformed. The tremors continued, subtle but undeniable, the fissures spreading like veins across the land. Zuri's spirit had made herself known in ways that could not be ignored, awakening both fear and reverence. The earth itself had become a herald of her presence, a living testament that no injustice, no matter how meticulously executed, could remain hidden from the force of a determined and righteous spirit. The morning after the first tremors, the village was gripped by a palpable tension that hung heavier than any storm. The elders and villagers who had orchestrated Zuri's nameless burial awoke with uneasy hearts. The once ordinary ground beneath their feet now seemed alive, shifting subtly, vibrating in ways they could neither predict nor control. Each movement of soil, each faint creak of roots and stones, reminded them of their guilt, gnawing at the edges of their minds like a relentless tide. The earth was no longer merely a passive stage for their actions. It had become a participant in Zuri's undying presence. At first, they tried to convince themselves that what they were witnessing was natural. Minor earthquakes, settling soil, perhaps even the exaggeration of fear. Yet, as the hours passed, the evidence became impossible to deny. Tiny fissures crawled outward from the site of Zuri's grave, splitting stones that had lain untouched for decades. Roots of trees above twisted unnaturally, bending and curling as though responding to an unseen hand. Animals behaved erratically, fleeing en masse from the trembling patches of earth, adding to the sense of impending doom. The villagers who had once directed ridicule at Zuri now realized that ridicule had awakened forces far beyond their comprehension. The accusers themselves were the first to feel the grip of panic. They had expected her silence, her erasure, but instead they were confronted with the undeniable proof of her ongoing existence. One by one they approached the site, drawn by fear, curiosity, and a desperate need to assert control over what they had set in motion. As they neared, the vibrations intensified, almost as if Zuri's spirit recognized the presence of those responsible for her suffering. The earth trembled beneath their feet, small rocks bounced slightly, and the grass quivered violently, sending shivers up their spines. The guilty could no longer remain in denial. Voices that had once been loud and commanding were now muffled by fear. It is her spirit," one whispered to another, barely audible over the hum of the vibrating earth. Another elder muttered, "We cannot have buried her nameless, she is calling out to us and the land answers her." Their minds raced, grappling with the horrifying possibility that their actions had created a force far stronger than they could have imagined. Guilt mixed with terror, creating a potent anxiety that infected their every thought and action. As the day progressed, more signs emerged. Stones lifted and rolled across paths without visible cause, small fissures extended their reach, and subtle sounds, like whispers carried through the soil, echoed around the burial site. The guilty watchers could hear their own names in hushed tones carried by the vibrations, and their hearts leapt with a mixture of fear and recognition. Each tremor seemed to confirm that the buried girl was alive in spirit, and that her presence demanded acknowledgement. Panic spread beyond the immediate accusers. Other villagers, observing the frantic reactions of the elders, began to sense that something extraordinary and terrifying was occurring. Fear, once contained and regulated by strict customs, now roared unchecked. Children clung to their mothers, the young men and women hesitated in their chores, and the village square, once a place of routine and order, became a theater of unease. The soil, moving subtly yet unmistakably, reminded all who watched that Zuri's story had not ended with her burial. The accuser's guilt amplified their fear, creating a feedback loop that seemed to intensify Zuri's influence. Every tremor, every crack in the ground, every rustle of leaves seemed to echo their conscience back to them. One elder fell to his knees, clasping his hands over his eyes in despair. "We cannot hide the truth," he whispered, voice trembling. She lives, and we are the ones who condemned her." Another, pacing near the fissures, tried to rationalize the events with disbelief, but each tremor reminded him that the soil was no ordinary ground. It was alive with Zuri's voice, her awareness, and her unyielding demand for justice. The panic escalated when more dramatic signs appeared. Small stones leapt from the earth as if thrown by invisible hands, fissures widened, and faint hissing sounds echoed from below. Birds circled overhead, calling out in alarming patterns, and even the livestock refused to enter certain areas, shying away from the trembling soil. The villagers could no longer attribute these events to coincidence. Every instinct screamed that the earth itself had been transformed into a messenger, a witness to their wrongdoing, and a herald of the consequences they could no longer escape. By midday, the guilty parties had retreated to the edges of the village, too afraid to approach the trembling ground directly. Some tried to warn others to stay away, but the whispers and tremors followed anyone who came near the site. Even the skeptics could feel the vibrating pulse beneath their feet, the subtle insistence that Zuri's spirit demanded acknowledgement. Panic now mingled with awe, and the villagers began to whisper of ancestral justice and the power of wronged spirits. As night fell, the accusers huddled together, unable to sleep, their minds racing with fear. They knew that no story of natural occurrences could explain what had transpired. The ground, alive and responding, carried a moral weight that they could neither ignore nor overcome. In their hearts, they understood that the attempt to erase Zuri, burying her without a name, stripping her of identity, had failed. The earth had become her voice, her instrument of revelation, and her warning. Injustice, no matter how meticulously planned, would not remain hidden. By the end of the first day of panic, the entire village was aware of the unusual events. Fear, respect, and wonder mingled in the hearts of all who witnessed them. The accusers, once confident in their ability to control the narrative, now trembled in the face of forces far beyond their understanding. Zuri's spirit had made itself known, and through vibrations, whispers, and movements in the soil, she was demanding recognition, justice, and the acknowledgement that their actions could never truly bury her. As the sun rose over the village, a strange and breathtaking sight began to unfold at the edge of the fields where Zuri had been buried namelessly. The soil, once level and unremarkable, started to swell subtly at first, like the gentle rise of a tide. Villagers going about their morning routines paused, sensing a movement beneath their feet that defied logic. The ground seemed alive, responsive to something far beyond human comprehension. At first, the swelling was slow, almost imperceptible, but within minutes it became clear that the earth itself was reshaping itself with purpose. Small mounds formed along the burial site, rising gradually yet steadily, their contours forming patterns reminiscent of human shapes. Some villagers gasped as they realized that these elevations resembled a figure emerging from the soil, a faint silhouette of a woman standing tall, her arms raised as though calling out to the heavens. Others covered their mouths in fear, unsure whether to flee or remain and witness the miraculous sight. It was a display of power both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a physical manifestation of the spirit that refused to be erased. Zuri's consciousness flowed through the soil, guiding the rising earth with intention. Each movement was deliberate. Hills and mounds shifted to form curves and lines, creating symbols that conveyed her presence, her pain, and her identity. The villagers noticed that the patterns were not random but appeared to tell a story, one that spoke of injustice, resilience, and the refusal to be forgotten. The shapes in the soil were intricate and precise, as if the land itself had learned to speak on her behalf. Animals in the vicinity reacted immediately to the transformation. Birds circled overhead in intricate patterns, almost tracing the shapes of the rising mounds. Squirrels, rabbits, and even the more elusive forest creatures hesitated at the edges of the fields, their instincts alerting them to the extraordinary energy emanating from the soil. The wind carried faint murmurs, whispering through the leaves and grasses as if the trees themselves were participating in the revelation. Even the villagers who had once mocked Zuri felt an undeniable reverence, their fear mingled with awe at the living testament of her spirit. The elders convened in urgency, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Some whispered of ancestral spirits, long-forgotten protectors who ensured that justice could not be suppressed. Others, more skeptical but unable to ignore the phenomenon, questioned whether the earth itself had become Zuri's messenger. "She cannot be buried nameless," one elder muttered, eyes wide. "The land is showing us that her story must be remembered." Each rise and curve in the soil felt like a declaration of truth, an irrefutable statement that the attempts to erase her had failed. As the mounds continued to form, the silhouette of Zuri became more defined. Villagers could make out details that resembled her posture, her strength, and even the outlines of her face. Though no one could see her physically, the earth had sculpted a living memorial that radiated her identity. It was as if the soil itself had learned to carry memory, grief, and spirit, creating a monument that was at once terrifying and beautiful. The transformation was accompanied by subtle sounds that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The shifting soil created low rumbles, almost like a voice speaking beneath the surface. Some villagers swore they heard whispers, Zuri's name spoken softly, the syllables vibrating through the ground and into their bones. Others claimed to hear fragments of sentences, pleas for justice, and reminders that no one could erase her existence. Even the most skeptical observers could not deny the power and clarity of these manifestations. As the day wore on, the rising soil began to extend beyond the immediate burial site. Fissures and elevated mounds spread outward, tracing pathways that seemed to guide the eye toward the figure at the center. The ground itself became a living map of her story, a testament to her spirit and an unignorable display of presence. Villagers stood in clusters, some trembling with fear, others silently weeping in recognition of the miraculous display. The earth, long thought to be a passive witness to life and death, had transformed into an active participant in declaring truth and identity. The effect on the village was profound. Children, who had been frightened by the previous tremors, now stared in wide-eyed wonder, unable to look away from the rising shapes. Adults, many of whom had participated in Zuri's burial, felt a deep unease, realizing that their actions had awakened forces they could neither control nor suppress. The patterns in the soil conveyed not just Zuri's presence, but her strength, her dignity, and her unbroken will. It was impossible to remain indifferent. The earth had become a teacher, a storyteller, and a guardian of justice all at once. By afternoon, the silhouette of Zuri in the soil had taken on an almost tangible presence. The shapes of her arms, torso, and face were clear enough that any observer could recognize them as symbolic of her life and spirit. The villagers could feel the energy radiating from the rising ground, a pulse that resonated with truth, courage, and the refusal to be erased. Even the skeptics felt a shiver run through their spines, acknowledging silently that the girl they had tried to bury without a name now commanded attention from the very land they lived on. As night fell, torches were lit along the edges of the site, casting shadows across the mounds. The patterns and shapes became more dramatic, the rising soil illuminated by flickering light that danced across the contours of Zuri's manifestation. The villagers could no longer deny the miraculous occurrence. It was clear that the earth itself had aligned with her spirit, giving her a voice that could not be silenced, a presence that could not be hidden, and a truth that demanded recognition. By the end of the day, fear had shifted into awe. Villagers whispered to one another, some in reverent tones, others in fearful acknowledgement, that the land had chosen to honor her when they had tried to erase her. The rising soil was no longer just earth, it was Zuri's proclamation, her identity, and her demand for justice made manifest. The village square, once a place of mundane gatherings and routine ceremonies, transformed into a stage of reckoning. The earth itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it were holding its breath in preparation for justice. Villagers who had witnessed Zuri's rising soil and heard her voice now gathered, their eyes wide with awe and determination. They no longer whispered in fear. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones of accountability and truth. The ground beneath their feet vibrated subtly, a reminder that Zuri's spirit remained ever present, an unyielding witness to the wrongs committed against her. The accusers, who had once acted with impunity, now faced a tide of villagers emboldened by the truth. Their faces, pale with terror, reflected the guilt they had tried to bury along with Zuri. The trembling earth seemed to mock their attempts at composure, sending tiny fissures across the square, rattling stones and lifting dust into the air. With each subtle quiver of the ground, the accusers realized that their deception could no longer shield them. The soil, infused with Zuri's spirit, demanded acknowledgement and justice. As the villagers approached, they surrounded the guilty parties, their steps deliberate and their voices resolute. "The truth is clear," one elder declared, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his heart. "Zuri was innocent, and the earth itself has testified to her suffering. We cannot allow injustice to stand." The accusers trembled, their bravado vanished in the face of collective witness and the persistent presence of the earth's power. Even those who had hoped the girl's story would remain hidden could no longer ignore the undeniable signs: the rising soil, the whispers through roots, the trembling ground, all proclaiming Zuri's innocence. The villagers demanded that the accusers confess, and as words were forced from trembling lips, the earth responded. Small quakes shook the square, fissures widened beneath their feet, and dust and pebbles skittered in all directions. It was as if Zuri's spirit, channeled through the living soil, was reinforcing the truth, ensuring that the guilty could not escape the consequences of their actions. The soil acted as a judge, jury, and witness simultaneously, making it clear that attempts at deceit or denial were futile. Some of the guilty fell to their knees, begging for mercy, their voices cracking with terror. We did not mean to," one whispered, only to be interrupted by the subtle tremor of the earth beneath them, shaking off their excuses like dust from a cloth. Their words rang hollow against the undeniable testimony of the land, and the villagers knew that justice demanded more than words. It demanded acknowledgement, repentance, and the restoration of honor to the one wronged. The crowd, emboldened by Zuri's guidance, spoke together, declaring that the accusers would no longer hold power over the village. Their authority, once enforced by fear and tradition, had crumbled beneath the weight of truth. The earth continued to pulse and shift in response, rising slightly beneath the guilty to emphasize their exposure, reminding all present that they could not escape the moral consequences of their deeds. Even skeptics who had doubted the supernatural felt the undeniable moral weight of the moment, compelled to act in accordance with what was right. With each confession and acknowledgement, the soil seemed to settle slightly, as if Zuri's spirit was allowing justice to take root. The villagers realized that the reckoning was not solely about punishment but about recognition, the recognition of innocence, of courage, and of the enduring power of truth. The guilty, stripped of pretense, were forced to confront not only the villagers' judgment but the unwavering witness of the earth itself, which had preserved Zuri's story and ensured that it could not be ignored. By mid-afternoon, the accusers, humbled and terrified, had publicly confessed their actions and sworn to amend the wrongs they had committed. The villagers listened, their expressions a mixture of relief, awe, and cautious hope. The earth beneath them still vibrated gently, a subtle reassurance that Zuri's spirit remained vigilant and that the reckoning had restored a balance disrupted by cruelty and fear. The square, once a site of oppression and silence, had become a place of moral clarity and collective empowerment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the square, the villagers understood the magnitude of what had transpired. They had witnessed the power of a wronged spirit made manifest in the living earth, compelling justice and inspiring change. The accusers, once confident in their impunity, had been humbled and exposed, and the village as a whole had been transformed by the experience. Zuri's spirit, ever present in the soil and the air, had guided the people to recognize truth, face consequences, and embrace fairness over fear. In the quiet that followed, the earth settled, but the memory of the reckoning lingered. The villagers knew that Zuri's voice and the rising soil had changed them forever, leaving a permanent mark on their conscience and their collective identity. Her justice had been served, not through vengeance alone, but through the unyielding power of truth, courage, and the living witness of the land itself. After the dramatic reckoning, the village was quiet, the air thick with awe and the lingering presence of Zuri's spirit. 4 days, the villagers had witnessed the power of the earth responding to injustice, sending tremors, rising soil, and whispers that no one could ignore. But now the time had come to restore what had been stolen: Zuri's name. Gathering in the village square once more, the elders, children, and other villagers assembled around the very spot where she had been buried, now marked by the sculpted mounds of earth that had risen to reflect her presence. An elder stepped forward, holding a simple scroll made of woven fibers, a symbolic representation of memory and acknowledgement. His voice resonated across the crowd as he spoke: "Today we honor a soul who was denied justice. Today we restore what was taken from her, the very name that binds identity and memory. Zuri, we acknowledge you." The words hung in the air and a hush fell over the villagers. In that moment, it felt as though the earth itself paused, waiting for the final act of recognition. As the name was spoken aloud, the ground beneath them vibrated gently, no longer in anger or accusation but in affirmation. The mounds and patterns that had shifted violently during the reckoning now settled into calm, solid forms. Birds returned to the branches, leaves stilled, and a serene hush spread across the fields. The soil, once restless with the energy of injustice, seemed at peace, signaling that the balance had been restored. Zuri's spirit, though still vibrant and present, no longer radiated the fury that had compelled the earth to rise against wrongdoing. Her message had been heard, her story officially acknowledged, and the village now recognized her truth. Villagers approached the restored site, placing small offerings of flowers, polished stones, and hand-carved charms into the sculpted mounds. Each gesture was a pledge to remember Zuri not as a nameless victim but as a courageous soul who had defied erasure. Children, who had been frightened at first by the supernatural displays, now looked on with fascination and respect, learning that bravery and truth can withstand even the harshest injustices. The elders reminded them that a name is more than a word. It is a declaration of existence, a recognition of identity, and a safeguard against erasure. The accusers, humbled by the earth's witness and the villagers' collective action, were present too, standing in silence. They observed the restoration, understanding that their past deeds could never be fully undone, but that acknowledgement and sincere remorse were the first steps toward balance. Some of them placed tokens into the earth as well, small acts of reconciliation guided by the knowledge that the land and Zuri's spirit were vigilant. The village had learned that justice is not only about punishment but also about recognition, remembrance, and respect for those wronged. As the ceremony drew to a close, the villagers felt a tangible shift in the atmosphere. The restless energy that had haunted the burial site for days was replaced with a harmonious stillness. The land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, calm and nurturing, as if it recognized that the wrongs had been rectified. The mounds remained, now symbols of resilience and justice, but they no longer trembled or rose threateningly. They were monuments to memory, reminding everyone that identity and truth cannot be buried or silenced indefinitely. From that day forward, Zuri's name was spoken freely, her story shared across generations. Songs, stories, and teachings arose from the village, all celebrating her courage, endurance, and the extraordinary way in which the land itself had demanded acknowledgement. The villagers understood that restoring her name was not only an act of justice for her but also a moral lesson for the community. The land had screamed her identity back into the world, and now it rested, calm and assured, as a witness to harmony restored through truth.